Hello, this is Professor Gavoor again, and we're talking about monopoly and antitrust policies now. We're in Chapter 11 of the OpenStax book, and we want to cover corporate mergers. How do we regulate anti-competitive behavior? We want to talk about regulating natural monopolies and the great deregulation experiment that we've experienced in this country. One of the companies that the book talks about is Kinder Morgan. They're a natural gas company, and you can see here by their at one of their portside facilities where they import natural gas. They have a lot of, they're just a huge company. And being one of the largest distributors and maybe producers of natural gas, when does economy of scale come into play for them? Can other people actually come in and compete with them? That is a big question. So, merger is when two formerly separate firms combine to become a single firm, and an acquisition is when one firm purchases another. In my view of things, in most mergers, somewhere down the road, it ends up being like the acquisition of one company over another. When the acquisition is a bigger fish buys a smaller fish, and together they become an even larger fish. And mostly the bigger fish firm that merged, or that made the acquisition, mostly keeps their own people. The value of a merger or an acquisition is to cut costs, increased production and decreased cost structure, because you take two firms, add their market shares together, but you eliminate one CEO, one chairman of the board, one CFO, and that adds up to millions and millions of dollars when you look at all that redundancy. So in that merger, you've done all that elimination, but usually it ends up being one firm kind of dominating the other after a while. If we look at this data, and it's all the way back to 2012, so it's not the most recent data, but it's what's in the book. The number of mergers in 1999 and 2000 were relatively high compared with the numbers seen since then. While 2001 and 2007 saw a high number of mergers, these were still only about half the number of mergers in 99 and 2000. In 2012, the greatest number of mergers submitted for review for transactions were between 100 and 150 million. So this is the number of mergers admitted for review by the Federal Trade Commission. And these are the size of the transactions in 2012. So if we look at 2012, we had 1,429 submissions for mergers, and of those, here's the size of them in millions of dollars. So most of the time, the ones that reach the newspapers are really large. A lot of times, firms are bought up by venture capital companies to increase, kind of making a conglomerate out of their venture capital fund. And what venture capital companies try to do is trim the fat out of those companies and turn around and maybe spin them off again later and sell it to someone else at a more increased price than they bought it for. Now, there has to be some regulations for approving mergers, because you don't want things to get too big. You don't want to have only one airline company in the United States. You don't want to have only one cell phone company. You don't want to have only one automotive company, because you've eliminated competition. So you don't want one firm to control a majority or a large part of the market and become a monopolist. So historically, the U.S. has developed some antitrust laws, which started with the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, and the Seller-Kefauver Act. And you can read about those in the textbook, certainly. But over the years, they've tried to look at ways of measuring the market concentration and degree of marketing a monopoly power. One way that people used to do it was called the four-firm concentration ratio. It's not used as much anymore, but still taught in the microeconomics class. It measures what share of the total market sales in the industry are accounted for by the largest firms. And typically, it doesn't have to be a four-firm concentration ratio. It could be 4 to 8 firms. It could probably be 10 firms, I guess, too. But you rank order all the firms by their market share and add up the market shares of the top 4. And that will give you some sense of what that would be. A market share, each firm's proportion of the total market. Now, you have to define the market and you have to define the competitor. And oftentimes, if you're talking about cell phones, for example, you've got Apple and you've got Samsung and you've got all the other minor players. You only talk about Apple's share of cell phones. You don't talk about Apple's total market share in consumer electronics, for example. And Samsung makes so many other products other than phones. Again, you have to limit it to that. Now, there's something else called the Herfindahl-Hirshman Index, or HHI. This is what most people use right now. And in fact, the next 2 slides show how the Department of Justice uses this in their preliminary analysis or judgment of mergers. So this is from the Department of Justice, and it basically says the Herfindahl-Hirshman Index is a commonly accepted measure of market concentration. It's calculated by squaring the market share of each firm as a percentage, mind you, not as a decimal, and then summing the results up. For example, for a market share consisting of 4 firms, which have 30, 30, 20, and 20, the HHI is 2,600. 30 squared plus 30 squared plus 20 squared plus 20 squared equals 2,600. Since there's only 4 firms, the 4-firm concentration ratio would be, add them up, they would be 100. So it has an HHI of 2,600 and a 4-firm concentration ratio of 100%. In both measures, this would probably be considered high. If you look at the next slide, it says unconcentrated markets, the HHI is below 1,500. Moderately concentrated markets, the HHI is between 1,500 and 2,500. And highly concentrated markets, it's above 2,500. So this firm here is high in 4 firm because it has 100% of the market. That means there's only 4 firms in it. And the HHI is 2,600, so this would be considered high. Any merger of 2 of those firms would be given a lot of scrutiny. So the agency that employs the following general guidelines for relevant markets that have been defined. Small changes in concentration. Mergers involving an increase in the HHI of less than 100 points are likely to have adverse competitive effects or ordinarily require no further analysis. In unconcentrated markets, mergers resulting in unconcentrated markets are unlikely to have adverse, and they don't have but further analysis. Moderately concentrated markets, mergers result in moderately concentrated markets that involve an increase in the HHI more than 100 points, raise significantly competitive concerns, and often warrant scrutiny. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but it warrants scrutiny. And in highly concentrated markets, they really want to look at that. Mergers resulting in highly of the HHI going more than 200 points will be presumed to be likely to enhance market power. The presumption may be rebutted by persuasive evidence showing that the merger is unlikely to handle it, but this is from the Department of Justice and their guidelines using HHI. Now, how do we define a market in current terms? Sometimes I guess it's difficult and controversial because there's so many different companies that have their fingers in so many different quote-unquote markets. In recent decades, there have been two important shifts in how this is defined: technology and globalization. So when we talk about technology, is you could have a global firm that has great concentration. Like right now in the US, we have two major cell phone companies, Apple, Samsung. Everyone else is subservient. But if you go to China, both Samsung and Apple compete there, but it's way less concentrated market because there's many Chinese competitors. I imagine when the Chinese cell phone companies come here and the Chinese automotive companies come here, the concentrations in both those markets will be diluted. But there could be mergers moving forward in that regard, which could change those concentrations, of course. So technology makes companies, they can do a lot more with a lot less people in a larger geographic expanse. So the new approach to antitrust regulation involves detailed analysis of specific markets and companies instead of defining a market and counting up total sales. They do it by estimating the demand curves and supply curves of the firms proposing a merger, and they build a statistical model that estimates the likely outcome for consumers if the two firms are likely to merge. Now, I think they use the word merger to include acquisitions as well. From an economic standpoint, I think they don't care who buys who, or if it's a merger or an acquisition. They're just looking at the merged firm. So, under U.S. laws, monopoly itself is not illegal, but there are antitrust laws that include rules against some restrictive practices. And these are practices that do not involve outright agreements to raise prices or to reduce the quantity produced, but that might have the effect of reducing competition. One of the things in a market capitalist country like ours that we want to do is have competition and nurture innovation. That's why when we give a patent for a new drug, it has a limited amount of time. Hopefully, amount of time for the company that invested heavily in the R&D to develop the new drug to reap profits from it, and then during that same time period invest some of those profits into further research to keep their pipeline of new and innovative products coming. What are the types of restrictive practices? Well, it's minimum resale price maintenance agreement. So it requires a dealer who buys from a manufacturer to sell at least at a certain minimum price. That's kind of a restrictive process, but I know luxury firms do this all the time. Rolex does not. It's hard to find a Rolex at a discount price, because Rolex, if you're going to be a Rolex dealer and sell it below the manufacturer's suggested minimum price, they will delist you as a dealer, and no one wants to not be a Rolex dealer. So they monitor that very well. Toomey Luggage kind of does the same thing. Toomey authorizes sales when new models may be coming out, and they don't have real fire sales to move the old models out, but they do have sales. Exclusive dealing, an agreement that a dealer will sell only products from one manufacturer. Well, I guess, other than being a company store, a watch store would want to sell lots of different brands of watches and wouldn't want to be restricted to only sell one. Tying sales, a situation where a customer is allowed to buy one product only if the customer also buys another product. I've given the example of my father-in-law, where back in the 60s and 70s, when he was dealing with Heinz, and then an American company, not owned by a Brazilian conglomerate, Heinz ketchup was a big deal, and it sold well in his store, and he wanted to buy Heinz ketchup. The Heinz sales rep, and this is my father-in-law telling me, said, "We're not selling you Heinz ketchup unless you buy Heinz gravy," which was a new product. And he goes, "That product won't sell in my store." He knew his clientele. He knew the demographics of the neighborhood in which his store was. But Heinz was a big company. He was a small guy, and he was pushed by them, and he had to buy stuff that he knew wouldn't sell just to get the product that he wanted to have. So that was a restrictive practice. And he really didn't go to court or anything about it, but if it happened to him, it happened to lots of people. And bundling, a situation in which multiple products are sold as one. So in other words, if they said, we're going to sell you a pallet, every pallet of ketchup includes 3 cases of gravy, for example. That would be another way of tying sales together. You can't do that. You have to allow people to buy one product or the other. So most true monopolies today in the U.S. are regulated natural monopolies. And we've talked about that. This becomes a natural monopoly when the average costs are declining over the range of the production that satisfy the market demand. It typically happens when fixed costs are large relative to variable costs. And we talked about the natural monopolies that are what? Like utilities. You can't duplicate that infrastructure to have competition in a local market. So you want to have regulated natural utility markets, but there might be other markets that are regulated too. There's only one company really that makes submarines, nuclear submarines, for the U.S. Navy. There might be 2, but there's only one I know of, and it's General Dynamics, the submarine division of that company. So the U.S., do we need more than one submarine manufacturer? You want to regulate it, they have a monopoly, you're going to have a relationship with the government, it's going to continue. So the regulatory choices in dealing with a natural monopoly. I think we've talked about this before. But we'll go over it again because it's an important point. Okay, I think it's the same picture as well. A natural monopoly will maximize profits by looking where. So let's look at it again. We have a demand curve. We have a marginal revenue curve. And these are lines. We have an average cost curve and a marginal cost curve. And notice that the marginal costs and the average costs are going to intersect out here, outside of greater than the demand curve. So we find out where marginal costs and marginal revenue intersect at P, and it's at a quantity of 4. It could be 4,000, it could be 4, it could be 400, 4,000, 40,000, 400,000, or 4 million, depending on what the scale is. You shoot up vertically until you get to the demand curve, and that's where the monopolist wants to operate. He wants to operate at a quantity of 4 and a price of 9.3. So that's where the monopoly wants to produce. The antitrust regulators, like we said, if they split the company in half, they would want to, then each half would produce at point B, which has quantity of 2 and 9.75. The regulators might require the firm to produce at marginal cost equals D at point C. Right there. So that they would want you to operate at 8 at a price of 3.5. However, if the firm is required to produce a quantity of 8 at 3.5, they will suffer losses because it's below the average cost curve. So you don't want to put that burden on the company. So they split the difference between A and D and look at where the average cost curve crosses the demand curve at 6 and 6.5. So this is the battle. The monopolist wants to operate here. The regulators would love to have them operate here, but truly it makes more sense for them to operate here. So cost plus versus price cap regulation. What's cost plus? When regulators permit a regulated firm to cover its costs and make a normal profit above that. The problem with cost plus is that firms are willing to just let their costs go. That could be one of the problems why education costs so much right now. That's one of the arguments anyway, because there's government loans to cover tuition. There's no incentive for universities to truly try to be competitive and cut their costs. I think that's changing dramatically as we speak. I don't know when we'll see the results of that. The other one is called the price cap regulation. When the regulator sets a price that the firm cannot exceed over the next few years. This theoretically, if you want to make more profit, puts an incentive on the company to try to reduce their costs. And therefore, at the cap, the price cap, and the revenue that generates, they would generate more profit. So most people shy away from cost plus regulation because there puts no incentive on the firm to try to become more efficient. And theoretically, the price cap regulation does that. So deregulation is removing government controls over prices and quantities. Two heavily regulated industries used to be the airlines and trucking. Ronald Reagan deregulated both of them. So regulatory capture occurs. So that's one thing, that removing government controls. And right now, with the COVID era and the government basically having stakes in some large industries like airlines and hotels, it's going to be interesting to see how they manage and the kind of authority they try to put over them. When we looked at during the Obama administration and Great Recession, the government took stakes in the auto industry. And I don't know what kind of behind the scenes demands they put on the auto industry, but the auto industry did get much more efficient here and paid the government back at a profit. So hopefully if that happens again, it'll be good for the government coffers. It'll be a wise investment. Preserve the industry, make them more efficient, but let's see what happens. The other thing they have to watch out for is regulatory capture. When the supposedly regulated firms end up playing a large role in setting the regulations that they will follow. So the regulated firms, kind of capture the people regulating them and influence them. The problem is usually the regulators are government employees that are making a modest wage, and they're oftentimes dealing with corporate folks that have a much, much higher pay than them, meaning they have a higher level of education and probably experience and sophistication. So regulatory capture is when the regulated company really dictates through force of will as much as anything else how the regulators behave. The effects of deregulation. We have this Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It was designed to increase confidence in financial information provided by public corporations to protect investors from accounting fraud. This came about in the late 90s, maybe early 2000s, when you had companies like Enron and a variety of other companies that just were misbehaving so badly and had grown so big, and you couldn't trust their accounting information at all. The Dodd-Frank Act is to promote financial stability of the country by improving accountability and transparency into the financial system. They wanted to end the too big to fail to protect the American taxpayer by ending bailouts, but we still end up doing bailouts when we have these huge shocks like the Great Recession and the current shock that we're having right now, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. So, airline deregulation, let's look at that. The U.S. government in 1926 regulated the airline industry, giving airlines permission to fly certain routes based on mail delivery needs. Probably made sense then. In 1934, the antitrust authorities charged the Postmaster General with colluding with the major airlines to monopolize the nation's airways. Wow. Think about that. In 1938, the U.S. government created the Civil Aeronautics Board to regulate airfares and routes instead. In 1978, the Airline Deregulation Act took place and took the government out of the business of determining airfares and schedules. So I'm guessing that was the Carter era, actually. A late Ford or early Carter. Following the 30 years, greater competition from deregulation has reduced airfares, increased efficiency, and offered more service, and increased jobs. Also, there's been a string of mergers, but the prices have still stayed down because it's competition. So I think it maybe went from the domestic airlines in this country, went from a monopolistic competition to maybe an oligopoly, even though there's a lot of small players that are doing the shorter runs for the larger airlines. So here's a question. Since deregulation, how has the string of mergers raised concerns over how competition might be compromised? Has it affected the consumer product and demand for it? Well, I remember before deregulation, I used to fly, mostly to play music or visit relatives. And we could be in an airplane no airplane was ever full. And I've been on airplanes that had 3-4 passengers on it. It was like almost a deadhead run back to the other city where maybe it might be more full coming back. Shortly after deregulations, the airlines were allowed to set their own schedules. They still had to, I think, apply for routes, but that was covered by the airports. The airports couldn't handle more airlines than they had gates. But airports expanded. All of that changed. We went to the hub structure where airlines kind of had a monopoly over certain routes, but in big cities, you had the big 3-4 airlines always playing there. And now the flights are always full. And the prices haven't gone too crazy. I would think relative to inflation, the price increases have risen less than the rate of inflation over the long term. So it usually shows this is an example of how competition actually works. The same happened in the trucking industry. And colleges aren't regulated, but education has a lot of government loans. So if everybody had to pay their own and you eliminated government loans, that would be horrible for the students that are currently counting on them heavily. But after a period of paying, 3-4 years, 5 years, I would think college costs would come down dramatically. You'd have a lot more commuter colleges and a lot more online programs and some combination, and people would, if you want to pay for the college experience where you go live away from home in a dorm, that's probably going to still cost you kind of close to what we have now. But if you want to have a commuter college and get a solid education like you get at a community college and expand that, maybe some community colleges would expand to 4 years, it would be hard to beat their prices. So anyway, it's my 2 cents there. And thank you for listening to this lecture. Talk to you again soon.